Our message out of Psalm 66 this morning, focusing on coming and seeing what God has done. It popped into my head to spend a minute reflecting on the life of someone you may or may not know about, and that is Hudson Taylor. Lived from 1832 to 1905 and spent 51 years of his life working in China as a missionary. He was the founder of China Inland Missions. During those 51 years, that mission agency brought 800 missionaries to China. They founded 125 schools and brought about 18,000 people to the Lord. 18,000 during his lifetime. The organization that he founded was non-denominational, which for the time was a little progressive. Not everybody was willing to do that. He took workers from all classes, rich or poor, didn't matter to him. He even allowed single women to come on the mission field, which a lot of agencies would never have done. He was extremely dedicated to his work. Notice I just put a couple of his quotes because I think these are indicative of his willingness to see that it wasn't him. He wasn't the one that was making this happen. He said, "All God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on God being with them." It's a good point. There are three stages to every great work of God. First, it's impossible, then it's difficult, then it's done. And he also said I typed it wrong. God's work done in God's way will never lack God's provision. Either I typed it wrong or I was auto-corrected. We'll figure it out. All right, so our text this morning from Psalm 66. What has God done? And let's talk about that. So let's look at the first two verses. This is not a Psalm of David. At least it doesn't tell us it's a Psalm of David. We don't have an author. So let's just approach it as a generic psalm. It says, the first two verses, "Shout for joy to God, all the earth. Sing the glory of his name. Make his praise glorious." Now, you may have been misinformed. You may be under the wrong impression, but in fact, the people of God are supposed to be full of joy. You're aware of that, right? God's people are supposed to be happy. We're supposed to be joyous. Now, of course, there is a time and there is a place for a somber attitude, right? There are moments of solemnity when we gather on Good Friday. Our hearts, our minds are in a different place. But by and large, day in, day out, the people of God are supposed to be characterized by joy and happiness. That's sometimes an issue. And their response to that joy is to let it bubble over, let it overflow from within them into singing the praises of God. Now, there is one thing that I have heard consistently over the years from people when talking about singing. The most common thing that I ever hear back from someone, and a number of you have told me this, is, "I can't sing." I'd ask for hands of how many of you have told me, "I can't sing," but I see some of you and I know who I'm talking to. You say, "I can't sing." I don't see where it says, "Sing the glory of his name, those of you who sing well." Now let me give you a way out. When we do the hymns, at least, and Dennis is playing on the organ, and I'm standing here in front of the organ, I can't hear a thing other than the organ. I can hear myself, right? You're aware I sing loudly? You're aware of this? It's not a secret. I'm a loud singer, so I can hear the organ, and I can barely hear myself over that. If you sing off-key, I won't hear it. If you sing at the wrong beat, I won't hear it. So especially, we'll start with that, right? Start slow, start easy. Pick the ones where we have the organ playing, and just sing out. I won't know it. It'll be okay. You won't need to be embarrassed. And then gain some confidence and sing louder when we're just using the piano or when we're singing the praise music. Sing out. Why? Because his name is glorious, because his praises are deserving of our singing. So we need to do it. Whether we like it or not, whether we're good at it or not, whether it's our favorite song or not, we need to sing because we have joy. So that's where we start. Let's see where it goes from there. 3 and 4 says this, say to God. Before we were singing, now we're speaking. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds, so great is your power, that your enemies cringe before you. All the earth bows down to you. They sing praise to you. They sing the praises of your name. This reminded me, this first line, say to God, how awesome are your deeds. And you might wonder, where do I come up with my illustrations? These things just pop into my head as I'm looking at the text, as I'm writing things down. And for whatever reason, while I was looking at, say to God, how awesome are your deeds, this popped into my mind. Have I told you lately that I love you? Right? Rod Stewart, right? Have I told you there's no one else above you? All right? It reminded me of that. I don't know why. The idea that someone, and of course if you're sick, that song is aimed at the person that he loves, and he says, oh, by the way, have I told you that lately? Some of us have been married multiple decades, but it doesn't mean that we get to stop saying I love you. Get to stop saying why you appreciate the person you're with. Get to stop saying that, right? You don't say that to your spouse. I told you I loved you last year. What are you bugging me for? Right? Or to your children, I hugged you when you were 12. Why are you wanting that now? Right? That's not the way it works. Even though it's something we already know, even though it's something obvious, it still is worth saying. And so the writer tells us here, say to God that your deeds are awesome. God is fully aware, by the way, that God's deeds are awesome, right? God's not like, oh, wow, I appreciate that. I didn't know. God knows, but we're supposed to say it anyway. Just like our spouse, our children, I would hope, already know that we love them, but we're going to say it anyway. So say how awesome God's deeds are. So let me ask that question. Have you told God lately how awesome He is for the things He's done in your life? Have you said that? Whether it was out loud or just in your mind, have you actually said, God, you've done some awesome stuff in my life. I appreciate that. It's amazing. Thank you. Have you done that? And since we're like a couple days after Thanksgiving, this is like a freebie, right? Hopefully on Thanksgiving you were prompted, maybe some social pressure said you have to say something you're thankful for, and it worked. But if you haven't, now's the time. Here's the example the writer gives. So great is your power, your enemies cringe before you. And you might be thinking, that doesn't sound like the best kind of thing. The power of God brings joy to those who celebrate God, to the people of God, to those who worship and obey God. That power brings joy. But that same power to those who are in rebellion against God, to those who are antithetical to God, causes them to cringe in fear. The power is the same. The power hasn't changed because the power of God is just a fact of the universe that we live in. It is something that is common to all of our existence, is the power of God. The question is, does the reality of the power of God cause joy in your heart or fear? Because if you know God, it ought to cause joy. For those opposed to God, it causes fear. 5 and 7, come and see what God has done, His awesome deeds for mankind. He turned the sea into dry land. They passed through the waters on foot. Come, let us rejoice in Him. He rules forever by His power. His eyes watch the nations. Let not the rebellious rise up against Him. Before we were speaking to God, He said, say to God. Now we're sharing this with other people. He says, come and see what God has done for mankind. And the psalmist illustrates that by telling us what God has done for Israel, for the people of Israel. Because as you remember, Genesis chapter 12, God says to Abraham, all nations will be blessed through you. I will start with you, and that will be for all of humanity. And so what God has done for Israel, God has done for humanity. And then he gives one illustration, the crossing of the Red Sea. It could also be the crossing of the Jordan, of course, turning the sea into dry land, but the use of sea is probably leaning towards the Red Sea. The Old Testament writers bring that up again and again. You ever notice that? They're always talking about bringing the people up out of Egypt with a mighty hand. They're always talking about the crossing of the Red Sea. It's that one moment in their history that is indicative of the power and the love of God for his people. And so every generation of prophet and poet and writer in the Old Testament feels the need to go back to that and remember what God did when he brought them up out of Egypt into the promised land. And then at the end of this section it says, he rules forever by his power. Let not the rebellious rise up against him. We know that there will be those who rebel against God. It is inevitable. It is part of our human fallen nature that people rebel against God. But we also know that their rebellion is always futility. It's not going to win. It's not getting them anywhere. They're going to do it, but it's futile. It's a waste. You see, only a fool would strive against God, especially after God has demonstrated his power, after God has shown, this is what I will do, this is what I am capable of, and yet people strive against him. Thankfully, as the writer is saying, that's not us. We are not in that group. Instead, we're going down a different path. Look at 8 to 12. It says, praise our God, all peoples. Let the sound of his praise be heard. He has preserved our lives and kept our feet from slipping. For you, God, tested us. You refined us like silver. You brought us into prison and laid burdens on our backs. You let people ride over our heads. We went through fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance. This is a great section here. It says, he has preserved our lives and kept our feet from slipping. Those are an interesting two things going together because, of course, they're both important. We obviously pray for our very lives. It's a valuable thing for your life to continue. When your life is in danger, you want some respite. You want some rescue. So it's obviously important to pray to God to preserve us, save us. And yet, if we do not have more life, if we are granted that request from God, if God gives us more life, but we live that life in moral degradation, if we live that life in immorality, if we live that longer life in rebellion against God, what good has it done? We've only gathered for ourselves more wrath on the day of God's judgment. So the writer here says, not only have you preserved our lives, but you kept our feet from slipping. You allowed us to live that life that was a blessing and a gift in obedience to you, in following your will and your word. And that, of course, is a blessing. That, of course, is indeed worthy of praise. Now, we often pray for that, do we not? When we take our prayer requests, when we list the different people in our lives that have cancer, they have a heart attack, they've got this issue, that issue. We're obviously first and foremost praying, in most cases, that they live, right? That their health improve, that they get better. But along with that, they need this spiritual blessing as well. It's not enough to have uncle so-and-so or cousin this or neighbor that to have more time. They need to have that time to come to the Lord if they are not with the Lord. And if they are with the Lord, have that time to serve the Lord. How did he go about that? How did God keep his people from sin? It says he kept their feet from slipping. How did he do it? It says in the very next line, for you, God, tested us. Now, God didn't test them by sin, and He didn't tempt them to sin, because both of those things are impossible for God. God is holy and righteous. He cannot and will not use sin as a tool to shape His people. So what did He do? Notice the next line. It says, "You refined us like silver." That's what God did. This analogy is used quite a bit in the Bible, the analogy of refining someone like silver or gold, basically heating up the metal so that the dross comes to the surface and can be scraped away. A very common technique that's been used since ancient times to purify metals. In other words, God kept their feet from slipping. He tested them by applying some kind of pressure, by applying a metaphorical heat, something that would make them uncomfortable. Here's something you already know. People rarely change when they're comfortable, right? When you are in a place in life where you feel content and comfortable, you want it to stay the same. If your job is going well, you're not looking elsewhere. If your relationships are happy, you're not trying to find new ones or end them or anything. You're just going to keep it comfortable. You wear a pair of shoes until they're uncomfortable, right? At least I do. I don't care what they look like. As long as they're still comfortable, as my feet aren't falling out, I'm going to keep wearing that pair of shoes. When we're comfortable, we don't change. What the psalmist is here saying, thank you, Lord, for not allowing us to remain comfortable in immorality. Don't let us be comfortable in mediocrity. Don't let us be comfortable in blah, in something that's just not good. He says, instead, you brought us into prison, you laid burdens on our backs, you let people ride over our heads. That's a crazy sounding one. We went through fire and water. I don't know if the fire and water are meant to be literally here. Those would be challenges, right? Fire, floods, those are bad things. Plenty of people in our nation have gone through those in recent times. Or if that's just a metaphor, because I think that's how life's turmoil sometimes feel, right? Isn't that what the song says? Oh, I've seen fire and I've seen rain. He ripped this off. Does he know that? How do we respond to those things is the question. When we are in the pressure cooker, when we are being pushed and prodded and shoved, and life is pushing on us, our health, our job, our relationships, everything is a mess. Do we abandon God? Do we strike out on our own in desperation and folly? Or do we cling to God? Do we at that time say, that is when I need the rock? He says, we went through the fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance. You see, once they were refined, once their impurities were removed, once they had gotten past the disobedience and the rebellion, once they had become true servants of God, following His word, then God could lead them to a bountiful place. Then God could bless them. Why does God test His people? Why does God bring His people through trials and tribulations? For their own good. For the same reason your parents made you eat your vegetables, made you get up and go to school, made you do all sorts of things, brush your teeth, all that stuff that when you were 2 or 4 or 8 or 17, depending, you were not a big fan of. You did them for your own good. And God brings us at times through trials and tribulations, not to make us fall, but to help us to stand. Verses 13 to 15, I will come to your temple with burnt offerings and fulfill my vows to you, vows my lips promised and my mouth spoke when I was in trouble. I will sacrifice fat animals to you and an offering of rams. I will offer bulls and goats. This section is kind of a response to the previous section, right? We've been through fire and flood. We were through trouble and tribulation. And then he says, I will come to your temple and fulfill my vows. Evidently saying that when I was tested, I didn't try bargaining with God. I didn't say the kind of thing you see in sitcoms, right? Oh, Lord, if you get me out of this, I'll do X, Y, and Z. Even though I've never prayed to you before, even though I have no intention of doing it, I'm going to say these things because I think it's going to work. That's not what he's talking about. These are not vows of bargains with God. You know that, right? You can't bargain with God. It doesn't work that way. You might have been able to manipulate your parents, your spouse, your boss, a bunch of people in life with some clever passive-aggressive manipulation or other things. That doesn't work with God, by the way. These are vows that were intended to be kept because of introspection. What happens when you are under trial? What happens when you are low, when you are struggling? Your mind opens up and you think about your life. Where am I at? Where am I going? What am I doing? Why is this happening? We think when we're uncomfortable. We think when we're struggling. And so in that time, we are more likely to make changes that are for the better, hopefully, because of the turmoil. Make those promises, those vows, those commitments to the Lord. And we're not certainly talking just about the other kinds of things. Sometimes we just make a commitment to eat better, to exercise, to work harder, to do this, to do that. These are the deeper things than even that. All of those are good. But when we are in trouble, our vows to the Lord, vows of service, vows of obedience, vows of faithfulness, sometimes that's the only way we'll listen to God. When trouble provides clarity for us, when we have that moment where we're willing to listen. How many of you are like that? You don't listen until it's really ugly. You don't pay attention until you don't have a choice. You don't change until it actually really hurts. Sometimes we're like that. And it would be foolish of us to back down from those commitments. If when you were down and you looked up to the Lord and said, I see now clearly, Lord, this is what I ought to do. And then a week later, a month later, the sun is shining and the birds are chirping and the trouble has gone, and you say, whew, now at least I don't have to do that stuff I was saying I was going to do. That would be dumb. That would be unwise, because that's just saying, you know what, God, I really wasn't listening when you thought I was. You're going to have to knock harder. That's not a good idea. It's not a good idea to tell God that you're too stubborn to listen without repeated attempts, right? That's not wise. So we need to make sure that when we cry out to the Lord in our distress, that we truly are on board with what we're saying. And then, towards the end, 16 to 19, come and hear all you who fear God. Let me tell you what he's done for me. I cried out to him with my mouth. His praise was on my tongue. If I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. But God has surely listened and has heard my prayer. Now it's come and hear. Now it's time to share this news with other people, because all those who fear God are the same people who have joy in the power of God. Those two are not incompatible. Fear of the power and the justice and the righteousness of God is the beginning of wisdom, is the beginning of our path to joy and happiness. And this should be the refrain that comes out of all of our mouths. Come and listen to what God has done for me. We have one of those songs like that, right? A lot of you like that song. Count your blessings. Name them one by one. Count your many blessings. See what God has done. Are you truly aware of what God has done for you? I'll pause. Are you actually aware of that? I from time to time like to use the phrase, there but for the grace of God go I. Do you really understand where you would be if not for the grace of God? Are you clear on how very blessed you are? Are you aware of this? And then the important thing, have you told anyone about that, or are you just keeping it to yourself? Is this something you're planning on taking to your grave? Not recommended. This is something that needs to be shared. I don't know with whom, because I don't know the people in your life. Don't just share it with me. Go ahead and share it with me. I'd love to hear it. But more importantly, share it with somebody who needs that right now. And I don't know who that person is. You might not know who that person is right now, but you will. If your spirit and your heart and your mind is open to the prompting of the Holy Spirit, you'll know who that person is that you are supposed to share what God has done for me. Notice in verse 18, if I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. Basically, he's saying this whole thing would have been a moot point if I was trying to hold on to my sin. God was testing me, God was refining me, and I said, oh Lord, I hear you, but I'm going to hide this one right here and keep it, because I like this one. This is my favorite. Don't ask me to give this one up, right? You ever had that issue when the doctor said, okay, you got to give up whatever, and you said, sure, except for, right? Sugar, except for caffeine, except for whatever the thing was that you were supposed to give up, but not all of it. How can we expect the Lord to be listening to us if we're cherishing sin in our hearts? That doesn't make any sense at all. How can you expect a holy and righteous God to bless you, to hear you, to work with you when you are holding on to your sin? He says, I know that would have been foolish. It would not have worked, but surely God has listened to my power, because he knew he didn't do that. He knew that in his heart he had abandoned sin. He knew that in his heart he was listening to God. And so he had no fear. Brothers and sisters, you do not need to fear that God is listening to you if you are not cherishing sin. If you are embracing the law of God and the will of God, God's listening. He's not going to say, I just don't feel like listening to you. That's not the way it works. If we are in obedience to God, God is absolutely listening to us. No need to worry about that. And then the end. Praise be to God who has not rejected my prayer or withheld his love from me. This last thought in this psalm about praise and sharing praise about the goodness of God, this last thought is a reminder that this whole message, this whole psalm is about grace. Because God is not obligated to us. God is gracious to us. God could have rejected each one of us because we're not holy. The Word of God says, be holy because I am holy. God could have said, nope, 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 and kept going all around the world and said, looks like I don't have to listen to anybody. Looks like I don't have to be kind to anybody because every single one of them is a sinner, every single one of them is a rebel, and therefore we're done. But God didn't. Instead, God was patient, God was long-suffering, God was merciful, God was gracious to us. And so the love of God holds out hope for the lost, eager to welcome the repentant home. The love of God, the grace and mercy of God is always the foundation of our thankfulness. 3 thoughts to walk away from as we finish looking at this psalm. Number 1, let's look and see what God has done for mankind. The psalmist says, come and see what God has done for mankind. So let's do that, right? Spend some time thinking about what God has done for humanity and include yourself within that. Secondly, when you are feeling refined, when you are feeling like you are under the fire, then cry out to God then. Go ahead and do it. That's what the right time for it. And then lastly, once we have been through that, once we have made that understanding of God's will in our lives, then let's go and tell what God has done for us. Go and tell. It's what we need to do. The church is not always good at that. We're good at letting people come and hear, right? That was earlier, right? Come and see, verse 5, come and see. When people come here, we are pretty good at sharing with them what God has done. I think we do a great job of that. 9 times out of 10, we hit that one pretty solid. We struggle with go and tell, because that's a little harder. Takes us out of our comfort zone, makes us act on our own. And yet that is what we need to do, because we have been blessed by God, we have been given great things by God, and we must share that with others.